Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Ruchi Thanawala. She's a cardiothoracic surgeon. Her KevinMD article is titled, How Accelerated Learning Platforms Are Pushing Surgical Education Forward. Ruchi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So, we'll talk about your article in a little bit, but first off, just briefly share your story and journey.
Yeah, so I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon, and some of the other unique things about me is I'm a clinical informaticist, a data scientist, and a surgical education researcher. And I am very passionate about it. And a lot of my research and work is centered in the space of how we can use data science and informatics to improve how we learn in healthcare. Hundreds of years, in this country and beyond, we've been training people to become physicians even longer than that. And we're in an era where data drives our lives. And how can we actually apply that within our healthcare environment where the stakes are so high? People trust us with their lives. And I think if there's a greater place to apply all the data and analytics, it's in that space. And that's what I'm committed to.
So I could imagine how busy you are as a cardiothoracic surgeon and how rigorous that training would be. How did you get interested in this additional facet of surgical education training?
Yeah, it actually came from my very own experience. So, as a PGY3 general surgery resident, I realized that information is just really not integrated. All exists in these separate little silos about how we learn. Like, we have to maintain a record of the procedures we do. We have to, get assessments so we can continually improve. All of this lived in these really disparate systems, and it felt incredibly inefficient. Additionally, a lot of our education is driven by our faculty's assessments of us, and this is not centralized. So at that point, I was inspired. I was just starting my informatics master's
Hmm.
to actually build out a platform to kind of change the way we do this. So I started that, and all of this was born from my own experience, which my experience is common to all the other trainees that I knew that I was training with, and then across the country.
All right, so let's talk more about that in your Kevin MD article. It's titled How Accelerated Learning Platforms Are Pushing Surgical Education Forward. How did your article come together?
So it came together really mapping out how we start from all of these data sources living in these like really different areas that are not connected together. Because let's be honest, there is not a lot of funding that drives data analytics within the training of physicians. It's very different where you're an attending physician, you're independent practicing surgeon or physician because you are, you know, doing these independent procedures and taking care of patients. But when you're training, it all just lives in its own little places. So this article is about the power of bringing it all together and then leveraging all these technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning as a branch of artificial intelligence, standard data analytics, advanced data analytics to understanding how we learn. Because once we understand how we learn, we can then accelerate learning. And those two things are not far removed from each other. So that's what the article is about, and that's what I center a lot of my work on.
So, talk about some of the challenges that the traditional surgical education model faces and how it could be disrupted or innovated from your standpoint and your background.
Yeah. So I'll tell you that there's a lot of low hanging fruit. We have been using the same model. If we want to talk within surgery, the Halstedian model that has existed for over 100 years. So the easiest way to disrupt this is actually to make it easy to gather information,
Hmm.
and that's actually where we are in competency-based medical education currently. Is historically most trainees, and I'll speak within surgery, and this actually spans other procedural specialties, would get maybe 10 plus assessments a year. We graduate from general surgery doing often over 1,000 operations.
Hmm.
So there are a tremendous number of missed opportunities. So probably one of the greatest disruptions is using this really well integrated workflow driven platform that can gather so many more assessments. And then when we have more assessments and understanding of learning, there's a lot more actionable data. So I think that's the greatest disruption that we've been working on, and I specifically have been working on. And we have found that when we have so many more data points, we understand it better. We're actually uncovering knowledge that we didn't even know that we had, like, information existed, and we are now seeing it. It's in front of our eyes.
So give us a hypothetical scenario of how these learning platforms would have kind of a real life scenario where you could see some of these learning platforms in action.
Yeah. So a scenario, take a real live resident
Yeah.
entering training, going to be doing general surgery training for 5 years. She comes in and you're assigned to her rotation and you're going to be all doing all these set different operations. From day one, she's getting directed feedback on every single operation she does. She sees her learning curves build out on a daily basis. She can understand where she's learning relative to her local peers, national peers.
Hmm.
Fast forward, PGY4. She's in her 4th year of training and she knows that she wants to be a thoracic surgeon. So now she's really focused on how is she learning these thoracic surgery operations. And right there in front of her and in front of her educators are where she is in her learning. So her learning can be tailored specifically to her on a regular basis. We talk a lot about personalized medicine. This is the era of personalized education, and that's what competency-based education is. So that's an example of how we can use these learning platforms to really drive personalized learning, which is so important for individual learner growth. And these learners, this PGY4, soon to be a cardiothoracic surgery fellow and attending, is going to be taking care of patients not too far off. So if there's a place we need personalized learning, it's in healthcare.
So are there any programs right now that use some of these personalized learning platforms? Like what kind of penetration do we have now?
Yeah, so I founded Firefly Lab, and it's at 15 different training programs, 10 different specialties. And the breadth of the specialties represents the fact that almost all the training paradigms have the exact same problem. And our penetration spans from large academic institutions like University of Iowa, OHSU, some of the UMass programs, to very important community-based hospitals because they too have the exact same challenges.
Talk about some of the obstacles that's preventing further spread of the platform.
Yeah, so some of the obstacles are, first, it's recognition and acceptance that we can do this better.
Okay.
I think, there is something to our attachment to how we've trained and learned, and recognizing, what, we have many ways to improve. And that's probably one of the behavioral barriers. Some of the other technological barriers is because EHR systems, a lot of these case logging platforms, a lot of these other systems, they have inherently built interfaces. Like there's been no technology. We are kind of leading the way in building this. So there are the tech barriers of building your own sort of like, API interface connectors, but we're overcoming those. So when you're driving the space and you're kind of the first to it, you encounter a lot of barriers in different sides, and that's kind of a behavioral example, and then the other one is a tech example. But once we get in there, what we are finding, which I think this demonstrates that this is a space that has been ripe for change and innovation, is that it sticks and there
Mhm.
is sustained use, which I think shows that we have solved a pain point that we as a medical community have been experiencing for a long time.
So when you talk about the pushback from perhaps people who are not familiar with the technology, or they simply say we've been doing this for decades, why do we need to change? What is some of the example of that pushback?
Yeah, so examples of the pushback is, the comment that, why do I need to write down the feedback? I give it to them verbally at the end of the case. While relevant, that verbal feedback is really important, but there is something that is of high value in written feedback because you can reference it. You can look at it again, like you review your notes. So that's an example. Others are, I don't have time.
Mm.
Things are really busy. I need to keep going with these cases. I need to see more patients because we're based on RVUs. That is a very valid point as well. But in healthcare, if we're in a training environment, we have a responsibility to that. And then also, as we are developing these platforms, we are trying to make them as usable and as focused on user experience as much as possible because we recognize we need to make it easy for people to do it.
One of the other things that you mentioned in your article was the emergence of AI and virtual reality tools to help with surgical education. So what are some innovations in those areas?
Yes, so multifold. Probably one of the most common examples is the use of computer vision
Hmm.
to help someone to know, say they're doing a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, you're removing someone's gallbladder, and you're like, do you have the anatomy exposed? correctly? Like, are you aware that this structure is here or not? Now you can see the value in that as someone is learning and you're learning to identify the anatomy and get your hands into the operation at the same time. That's valuable feedback that you can use on a regular basis. Previously, we've been dependent only on human educators for that information. But what this does by having these computer vision models is allow you to have another AI driven educator, if we would like to think of it that way, in the operating room with us, along with our attending surgeon who's helping us to learn. And then you can take that to the sim lab and practice that in, a high fidelity, low risk environment. Another place where artificial intelligence, in the realm of machine learning is helping in surgical education in medical education is actually in starting to predict where someone is going to be 2 to 3 years from now in their learning using
Mm.
deep neural networks for that, or neural networks and deep learning for that. So there are many ways when we think about artificial intelligence that we can help drive education. Another example, one of the projects I'm working on is using natural language processing to understand what do the residents understand about the operations as we look at their op notes. What is their cognitive understanding of what they're doing when they're writing it down in a narrative format, which is really important. We can see that evolve. So there are a lot of applications of artificial intelligence in surgical and medical education that are really changing our understanding of where we are, and then helping, importantly, to accelerate the time from where we are to where we want to be into a shorter time frame.
So you mentioned neural networks. They can actually predict what a surgeon would be like 2 to 3 years based on some predictive patterns that they're observing.
Absolutely. That's actually one of my areas of research is when we have large data sets, we're able to put these into these models and to understand within a band of probability where they're likely to be. And then, imagine this, like when we have an early learner who may be struggling in different ways and you can understand where they may start to stratify out a couple years from now, we could potentially change their trajectory. A practicing physician that wants to gain a new skill that perhaps has, a very protracted learning curve. If you can understand where you're going to be, then you can like target in interventions. And we're already working on that. And, we have proven out models that are able to do this.
We're talking to Ruchi Thanawala. She's a cardiothoracic surgeon. Her KevinMD article is titled How Accelerated Learning Platforms Are Pushing Surgical Education Forward. So, what can we expect in the next 1 to 2 years when it comes to these innovations as it relates to surgical education?
So I think we can anticipate that all of a sudden things are going to really start to come together. All these different data systems, and they're going to be, more and more of these platforms that are out there. And residents are really going to be used to, as will the educators, in personalized education. Our expectations will be that I will have a learning profile that is specific to where I am right now, where I want to be, and specific to what I want to be 5 to 7 years from now, what specialty I want to be in. And that is a very reasonable expectation. And we are essentially there right now. It is going to be further penetration. And then the next step is going to be understanding how revolutionary this work really is and how it's kind of changing the rate at which we're learning and driving competency-based education.
And my final question, Ruchi, tell us some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
So my take-home messages are to think big. When we see that there is a challenge that we're personally experiencing, like I did as a surgery resident, to take it on and to build actual innovations and solutions. If you're able to try them, test them, they're going to fail, and then eventually something will succeed. And I think probably one of the greatest values in working in this space in medical and surgical education is the direct impact it has on us and all of our patients.
Ruchi, thank you so much for sharing your perspective, time, and insight. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.